So if passionate love feels so good, then why not experience it all the time? Well, essentially, it's physiologically impossible. This quote here is from the book The Love Myth, or rather The Happiness Hypothesis, in which Jonathan Haidt talks about this love myth that we have to some degree created in our society. He says, true love, this is the myth of love. True love is passionate love that never fades. If you are in true love, you should marry that person. If love ends, you should leave that person because it was not true love. And if you can find the right person, you will have true love forever. You might not believe this myth yourself, particularly if you are older than 30, but many young people in Western nations are raised on it, and it acts as an ideal that they unconsciously carry with them even if they scoff at it. But if true love is defined as eternal passion, it is biologically impossible. Essentially, it's not possible for our bodies to continue to maintain that level of arousal indefinitely. And also that things that produce a particular physiological response, gradually with time, the strength of that response erodes so that you need more intense experience in order to achieve that same level of arousal. So that those feelings that we get, that euphoria, that passion when we are physically attracted to someone, is very pleasant and very exciting, but it's not something that lasts. And so love as a long-term relationship cannot be based on passion alone. So the next type of love to talk about is this idea of companionate love. This love where you have the intimacy as well as the friendship together. And this is a more settled state than romantic love, based on friendship, comfort, and trust. A sincere knowledge of your partner and an understanding of who they are. Now, it sounds very pleasant and fine, but maybe a little bland for many of us who want some degree of romance in our intimate relationships. But this type of love is more closely associated with satisfying, long-lasting relationships. Oxytocin, again, going back to our biochemistry, or physiology, is also associated with many companionate love types of experience. So again, having that physical touch, that physical proximity releases oxytocin, but also having a close, intimate relationship with someone stimulates oxytocin, and having not necessarily a passionate connection, but an intimate connection can also make you feel good. And this last type of love that we'll very briefly discuss is compassionate love. And so this is not to be confused with companionate love. Compassionate love is more of an altruistic care and concern for the well-being of one's partner. It involves having generosity and empathy for others. Romantic love tends to ignore the flaws in one's partner. Compassionate love, in contrast, recognizes the partner's weaknesses and loves them anyway. So it's a love where you know and understand your partner. You're not overlooking their flaws, but you're willing to accept them and love the person either in spite of their flaws or simply because they're lovable, a person worthy of love and affection. In your textbook, the author also goes over several styles of love, and there's a table, 8.7, in the chapter that talks about several different types of love. Be familiar with those. I'm not going to go over them in this presentation for the sake of time and space. But look over them and be familiar with the different types of love, styles of loving for the upcoming exam. In this last section, we're going to look at just some broad strokes, cultural differences about attitudes about love. So in terms of cultural differences, it's important to consider what different groups of people value when looking at relationships and love. There are differences in how people view love, but not necessarily differences in how they experience love. So using functional MRI research, some scientists looked at romantic love in China compared to the US. And not surprisingly, they found that the same areas of the brain light up. So differences in love across cultures are not biological. That would be rather silly to suggest. But it's all about how people value relationships, what they view as important, and what the purpose of those relationships is. And so those differences in attitudes about love create differences in expressions of love as well as expectations for love and relationships. So very broad strokes kind of application. Generally speaking, Western, so European, Northern, and to some extent Southern American cultures put an emphasis on attraction and matching in love relationships. The expectation is for this living happily ever after kind of relationship, with my partner is the person who will make me happy. And marriage is, if not entirely, at least fundamentally based on this idea of love in intimate relationships. In contrast, Eastern relationships, so much of Asia, Middle East, and various other parts of the world, put an emphasis rather on mate personality and approval by others, particularly family members. The expectation is that love is somewhat of a mixed blessing. It may or may not be an important part of the relationship, and it isn't absolutely necessary for forming a relationship. Marriage is about building family and building community and making ties to your community. I've got a couple of examples here. I'll post these links on D2L, but they are essentially just a couple of different examples, somewhat stereotypical examples of more of an American style wedding proposal in comparison with an Indian arranged marriage and ceremony. So watch these videos and think about how love is contextualized within these two different relationships, how important it is or not, and the other people around them that are involved in their decision to get married. If we had had time to do a group work, this would have been it. Take some time. You're welcome to go over this. I won't require you to turn it in, but maybe think about this in particular. Once married, what is your prediction for each of these couples specific to satisfaction and stability in their relationship, and why? And try to draw on information from other chapters in order to answer this particular question. So finally, the question that we asked at the start of class on Thursday, does love last? Yes, it can, certainly, but not typically, or maybe not always, in the way that partners may expect it to. Think about expectations. We talked about expectations in Chapter 4 with regard to social cognition, as well as in Chapter 6 with social exchange theory and interdependence. People go into relationships often with expectations that may or may not be very accurate or beneficial to the success of their relationships. And relationships change over time. Remember back from earlier on in the semester, there was a snippet from a blog post that I read where the author very wisely wrote, your partner will change over the course of your relationship, but probably not in ways that you expect, and almost certainly not in ways that you can control. So going into your relationship is going to change and develop over time. If you work at it, you can have a long-lasting, loving relationship, but it's not going to be the same relationship that you started with. Remember, passion tends to fade. It's important to do things in your relationship to maintain some interest, but that arousal is going to wax and wane across the lifetime of your relationship. And so it's important instead to focus on all elements of love. And while romance can fade or may fade over time, it is usually replaced by a deeper, companionate, and compassionate love rooted in commitment that is ultimately much more durable. So remember, while romance is fun and exciting, and in the United States at least, very important, there's more to love than romance. There's also commitment and companionship, which are ultimately going to be the bedrock and foundation of any long-lasting, loving relationship.